Welcome back to Daytime Ottawa, this special edition as we celebrate International Women's Day, and Care Canada has been supporting women and telling us how they have been impacted so disproportionately on so many things like climate change and COVID and conflicts around the world. And here to talk more about it and some of the wonderful work that they do, I'm joined by Emily Wiseman. She's the Senior Gender Equality Advisor over at Care Canada. Emily, welcome. Really appreciate you spending some time. I know everybody at home probably recognizes Care Canada, but for those not familiar with the great work that you do, let's start off with that, Emily.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me with you today. So CARE is a leading international humanitarian and development organization. We work around the world to fight poverty and injustice and to help create a more equal and gender-just world. We place a special focus on working alongside women and girls, as you mentioned, because we know that we cannot overcome poverty until all people have equal rights and opportunities. And so we work in about 100 countries, and we reach about 90 million people through about 1,300 projects.
Wow. You mentioned, the impact that, women and girls face when it comes to those things, as I mentioned off the top. Maybe you could just expand on that when it comes to, conflict and COVID and climate change. How are they impacted differently from others in the world?
Yeah, no, that's a great example. And so one of the best ways that I can illustrate the different impact is we saw, for example, during COVID-19, what we saw called a shadow pandemic. And that was where we saw increases in gender-based violence, declines in mental health, job losses that disproportionately impacted women, increasing hunger and food security that resulted in a variety of negative consequences. And all of these different combinations really impacted to disproportionately impact women and girls, to a tune of where the World Economic Forum estimates that we lost about 32 years of progress on gender equality gains in the first 2.5 years of the pandemic. So we went from it taking about 100 years to close the gender gap around things like education, health, and economic empowerment to having it take 132 years. And when we look at economic empowerment specifically, the gap is now 151 years. So really tremendous impacts around gender equality. And this is why this International Women's Day CARE is really especially focused on women's economic empowerment and justice.
Well, and I guess a big reason for that, Emily, is there's not enough women at those decision-making tables around the world. I know that's a big focus you have at CARE. Tell us what the impact can be having more women involved in decision-making around the world.
Absolutely. And we've seen that whether it's a climate negotiation, a peace process, or whether it's just leadership within a hospital or a business, we're seeing a lack of women across a number of spaces and a lack of women's voices and the voices of other marginalized groups in decision-making spaces. And what that results in is it means that we end up with policies and practices that don't respond to the needs of women and other marginalized groups, and in some case can even harm those groups because their voices and their needs have just not been identified. And so when it comes to the work that CARE does, we really work to support individual women to access the knowledge and skills and capacities that they need to take on leadership roles within their communities. But we also work with their families, the men and boys in their lives, the business leaders, religious leaders in their communities as well, to support them on that journey in support of women's leadership. And we also look at some of the structures like sexual harassment, which your previous guest touched on, that can really limit the ability of women to thrive and succeed in their chosen area of work. And we know that when we combine all of these factors together, we can see some really remarkable successes. One of the things that we saw at CARE during the pandemic was we have something called a Village and Savings and Loan Association. And this is like a community group where women come together and they're able to pool their economic resources. They're able to make decisions together about how to spend resources that they have. They can access more loans and insurance and financial literacy. So it's a great space for them to come together. But what we found in the pandemic was that these groups, the women who participated, they were less likely to be negatively impacted economically. So their livelihoods were better during COVID. They had improved food security, and they had improved access to health care than women who didn't participate in these groups. And these groups ultimately, in a number of places, were looked to by their communities as decision makers, as leaders that could be followed. And they were able to distribute really crucial and important health information around the pandemic, and they were able to support their community in a variety of ways. And so that's just one example of how when you support women to do the things that they know their community needs, and when you put them in a position where they can make those decisions, really fantastic things happen, and we see really strong outcomes.
Yeah, and Emily, another focus you mentioned off the top was education. I'd like to touch on that again because, you know, women and girls and the lack of education and opportunity for education is still a huge issue around the world. How many women and girls are impacted by that, and you know, how has Care Canada helped?
Yeah, absolutely. A huge number of women and girls are being impacted by the loss of education as a result of the pandemic or a variety of other factors. And this is a really troubling area because we know that education is an area where it provides young women and girls with opportunities to gain skills and confidence, to learn new methods for navigating the world and to make choices in their lives. And we know that for every year a girl stays in school, it increases her long-term income earning potential by about 20%. And we also know that young girls who are able to stay in school and complete a primary education, they're 2/3 less likely to have negative maternal mortality deaths. So they're much more likely to survive childbirth, they're much more likely to thrive, and their own children are much more likely to succeed. All in all, education is really that cornerstone that we know sets young women and girls up for success to make choices for their own lives and to build a better future for themselves and their families.
Emily, I mean, I have so many other questions. I just want to say thanks so much on behalf of us here at Rogers TV on all the great work that you and your team do at Care Canada. Really appreciate your time here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. And I should mention as well, you know, when it comes to girl and women's education, you know, there's this alleged situation happening in Iran right now. There's a rally to condemn this mass poisoning of what they think is about 1,000 schoolgirls in Iran. So I encourage you to look more into that. We'll be right back after this.